think so, yeah. All right. All right, folks. We're going to get just started here. So we're going to wrap up session 20. I'm going to open us up in prayer, and then I'm going to give you just a few moments here to read your notes. I want you to look at not particularly your notes, but the outline that I gave you. So I want you to read just sort of skim through 19 and 20 and see if there are any things that we didn't cover that you'd like to talk about a little bit more, and then we'll just sort of launch into the second part of 20 and then get to 21. So I'm going to open this up in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time in which we get to really study your word once again and examine things like plot, subplot, and character. Be with us as we dive into the text and into the nitty-gritty of the technical parts of your word. In your name we pray, amen. So I'm going to give you a few minutes here to just kind of skim through the notes, because there's a lot of content. If you've ever looked, there's a lot of content in each session that I'm not covering just for sake of time. If we covered it all, it would take us forever to even more forevers to get through everything. So look through that, and then I want to plug this thing. So up front, there's a little free booklet called Easter Stories. This is written by Kevin DeYoung, and the illustrations are all by Don Clark. So a form of narrative criticism. This is a particularly evangelical conservative form of narrative criticism. It's not the one I subscribe to, but it's one that I find helpful. So pick up one of these and just see how they're reading the Bible as literature. So you can pick up it's right up at the front. It's free. So if you haven't gotten one, go grab one. But go ahead and read through your notes. Is there anything in there that's particularly interesting to you? We can just kind of chat about any section. We left off last week talking in 20 about characters in biblical narrative. We didn't get too much into it, but we're going to briefly look at that today. But anything at all? Cool. Well, if there's nothing, at any point in time, while you're reading the notes, if there's something that you want to touch on more fully, feel free to point that out. But without further ado, I'm just going to get into this part right here. Session 20, yeah. So feel free at any time to interject with something from the notes that you want clarification on. There's just a lot of content. So I work very hard on each session, pulling in all of the information we'll need to make it. This could really be taught many times over and in different ways. So that's by design. Okay, so here's where we're going to go today. Just to start off, we're going to talk about this moment of Jesus. Okay? I want to think through a little bit of the significance of Jesus as a character throughout this narrative arc of the Bible. So Jesus happens. What do I mean by that? Jesus happens. It's a little cheeky phrase, but what does it sound like it means when I say Jesus happens? Okay, that's a theological point. But think in terms of the narrative. What does it mean that Jesus happens? Yeah, Jesus is the subject, happens. Joe? Yeah, he comes into the picture at a specific point, right? In terms of the narrative arc, there's a time before Jesus, and then there's an event within the narrative in which Jesus happens. He becomes, right? And so Jesus happens, and then there's a lot of things that get sort of chain react off of the Jesus moment, right? What are some things that happen after the Jesus moment? You can think of any Jesus story that you know. He commissions the apostles, right? What else? What are the Jesus events? Okay, feeding of the 5,000 and all the other miracles, right? So the miraculous ministry. What else? Yeah, there's the borning of Jesus, right? The baptism of Jesus, the raising of the dead, right? Throughout there's the Lazarus, huh? Yeah, he weeps. So these are all the Jesus events, right? And so there's a point in the story before Jesus, and then there's the part where Jesus happens, and there's a significant uptick in events, right? Right. So if you can think of the Old Testament as this long, rising tension, right? You get to the end of the Old Testament and then it plateaus, right, for years. And then all of a sudden the Jesus moment, and all of the events start being rapid, and there's a lot of things happening. The miraculous events, the raising of the dead, the weeping, all those stories of Jesus, right? After Jesus, what happens? There's more Bible to get through. What happens? Yeah, well, it's the reflections of the witnesses and the reflections of the people who lived within the communities of the witnesses, right? So you can call that the apostolic period. So you have the times where the apostles that Jesus had commissioned are now reflecting on what happened and their experience of Jesus. They're trying to make sense and reflect on what happened in the Jesus events right here, right? And in the light of, and what are they using to make sense of the Jesus events?
Witnesses, testimonies, stories.
Sure, witnesses, testimonies. So what are they using to make sense of the witnesses and events and testimonies? Yeah, the Old Testament, right? The Hebrew Bible is what they're using to make sense of all of the Jesus events, right? And then they're using the Hebrew Bible to enlighten their understanding of what had just transpired. Under the guidance of the Spirit, they're doing this. And so what the four Gospels are doing is putting Jesus of Nazareth into the slot of all of these silhouettes, right? That's what's happening. All of the various silhouettes. What are some silhouettes of throughout the Hebrew Bible? Well, there's the prophet like Moses.
The priest, the high priest,
Yeah, the high priest.
the shepherd of Israel,
Yeah, high priest, shepherd.
the suffering servant,
Okay, the servant songs. There's tree of life. What else?
the Redeemer,
The
or the Savior,
sure. There's the
Messiah or something.
yeah. The Messiah is the better term. The Messiah, the anointed one,
The King,
the King. There's the true wise man. Right. So there's a lot of silhouettes, and part of the claim of the apostles is through the understanding of the Hebrew Bible, they understand Jesus to fit in fit in that silhouette, right? And so what the authors of the New Testament are doing are making a claim about what? They're making a claim about all of this and Jesus, right? They're making a claim about what this was all about all along. So that's where you get to this step. If the Jesus movement, where the Hebrew Bible right? So the Hebrew Bible, and so I'll do Hebrew Bible here. The Hebrew Bible, the former, and then you have the apostolic writings. The Jesus movement is where they fit together as one, not as a replacement of the Hebrew Bible, but as a continuity of the Hebrew Bible, right? It's not a replacement, right? That's called supersessionism. That's where the church replaces Israel. No, the church does not replace Israel. It's not a replacement theology. The church is a grafting on to the family tree, right? So you have the people of God in the Hebrew Bible, and then you have this new blossoming of the people of God in the apostolic period, right? So you should see the Hebrew Bible and the apostolic writings not as things in antagonism with one another, but as one coherent story, right? As one continuation of the narrative, right? This is important because oftentimes you have people ask, well, why do we have to read the Old Testament? Why do we have to read the Hebrew Bible? Because the apostolic writings, when they wrote it, they understood it as the end of the Hebrew Bible, right? They understood it as the logical continuation of the Hebrew Bible. To not read the Hebrew Bible is like not reading 3/4 of the story, right? And then you start from a false beginning, right? You start from the false beginning of Matthew, right? That's not where the story begins. It's not even where the story is in the middle. You're at the climax of the story, all right? So in order to make sense of anything, all of that is important, right? So the apostolic writings fit together with the Hebrew Bible as one coherent story. It's both the effect of history, but it's also a work of the Spirit, right? So for those of us who are not believers, it's just an effect of history that they're a coherent story. But for those of us who are believers, we believe that it's an effect of the Spirit that it's coherent at all, right? And it's the claim of the Jesus movement. So uniquely, I have an eraser, but I'm not using it. So uniquely, we have the Jesus movement. I'm going to erase happens and write movement here. Right? And so I use, if you've ever heard, even in my sermons, I tend not to use the word Christian, right? I use the word Jesus movement quite a bit because it's all-encompassing of the religious movements that followed from the Jesus events, right? It's a movement of people who are not uniform at all, right? They don't all believe the same thing. They don't all get to the same conclusions, but they're all the writing and all the literature spawns from the Jesus event, right? The Jesus moment, right? So the Hebrew Bible is still in the possession of the Jewish communities. So right after the Jesus event, around what time is the Jesus event? Around 30 or so, right? Circa CE, right? Common Era. So you have around 30 is the Jesus event, right? Around this time, who is still the primary reader of the Hebrew Bible? What group of people is reading the Hebrew Bible? The Jewish community, right? So at this point in time, the majority readers of the Hebrew Bible were the Jewish community. Yeah, they're reading the Septuagint, and then there's some Hebrew readers coming from the temple court, the temple cult, but most people are reading the Septuagint in Greek. So you get to this around the time of Jesus, everybody who's reading the Hebrew Bible is Jewish. Why is that? How come mostly Jewish people were reading the Hebrew Bible? It's kind of an obvious thing. It's their sacred text, right? Right. So the Jewish faith, right, Judaism at this point in time is still mostly ethnically Jewish, right? There are some people who have proselytized, and they're Gentiles who come to worship at the temple, but that's not, by and large, the population of the Jewish community, right, who are practicing. But there's a point in time, right? And I think because the Hebrew Bible at this point in time is in the position of Jewish communities, both then and today, this plot conflict of what Jesus solves is different, but depending on which community who are in the possession of the Hebrew Bible you ask, right? So if the Jewish community will probably identify the plot conflict differently, right, than those of us who are not really Jewish, not Jewish at all, or squarely in the Christian community, we probably will identify the plot conflict differently as well, right? Do you remember the Dead Sea Scrolls community? Right, so the Dead Sea Scrolls community are a community of Jewish, highly Jewish conservatives, right? So they were very, very, both politically and religiously conservative. The Essenes. So this community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were a religious group who were Jewish, but remember that Judaism, even in Jesus' time, there's not like one version of Judaism. There's very many kinds of Judaism, and they differed on a lot of things, theologically, politically, financially. Oh, I know, but we're talking specifically about this point in time, right? And so oftentimes when we think of the Jewish faith in Jesus' time, and as we read about the Jewish faith in Jesus' time, we sometimes keep them unified. That's why we like asking the question, how could they miss Jesus? That's actually a silly question because there's lots of reasons why they could have missed Jesus, depending on which group you were with, right? The Sadducees and the Pharisees were widely different groups. The Sadducees were far more liberal than the Pharisees. Yeah, but the Pharisees were far more conservative. And they conspired, even though they were at each other's throats, to kill Jesus. So there's just a lot of different moving pieces for the Jewish people then. But the Dead Sea Scrolls community, they were a particularly far conservative group. They were so conservative that they became completely ascetic, meaning that they left. They seceded from the Jewish communities in Jerusalem, and they hid in the Jordan Rift Valley. So, for example, it's like if JV and I decided that we wanted to be, we thought that UBC was going a really bad way, and we wanted to hide in the high desert in Joshua Tree. And we started our own community out there, and we just started a church out there. That'd be like that. That's what they did. Right? And so the Dead Sea Scrolls community, they left Jerusalem because they believed that the storyline that they were a part of was fulfilled through their group. They were the true Israel. And actually, the false Israel is in Jerusalem. Right? And so they needed to stay separate and keep clean and keep pure, which is why they meticulously preserved the scriptures. They didn't want it to be diluted with the Jerusalem Christians. Right? And they were very politically active. They hated the high priest. They did not like Herod or any of the temple cult or anybody who conspired with Rome, right? And so as far as the Essenes were concerned, everything that the Jews in Jerusalem were doing was a hell in a handbasket, right? And so they believed, this Jewish community, they believed that their storyline was fulfilled through them and their group. And they are waiting for a guy. Who are they waiting for? Whoever was going to fit that silhouette, right? This is the silhouette. They were waiting for this guy. They were, the Jewish, this community, their favorite silhouette was called the teacher of righteousness, right? The one who teaches righteousness, right? So this is that was their favorite silhouette. They were looking for the one who would teach righteousness. Right? What's significant is that what everybody agrees on is that this story, regardless of which sect of Judaism you were a part of, they all agreed that the silhouette needed to be fulfilled somehow. Right? They knew that the Hebrew Bible's story arc had not yet been completed. Right? And so there's still an anticipation for whichever silhouette you wanted to take to completion, there's still an anticipation for that. And so the resolution for which particular storyline you want to resolve will take a particular shape, depending on which silhouette you choose, how you identify the plot conflict of that particular silhouette. So the teacher of righteousness and the Essenes were particularly concerned for uprightness, right? And as far as they were concerned, Jerusalem had its back bent over with iniquity, right? So they were waiting for a teacher of righteousness who would once again straighten the way of the high priest, right? So like, however they get there, that's a very particular solution, right? They did not want to start war, right? They didn't think war was the answer. But you ask the zealots, like Peter. Peter was a zealot in the Maccabean tradition. They were looking for a king like David. David was the war king, right? The war king who would triumph over the enemies and establish his kingdom forever. So they're not looking for a teacher of righteousness. They're looking for a king like David, right? You see how just depending on which silhouette you emphasize, what plot conflict you choose to be the inciting incident, your resolution will change. And how you think everything gets solved is different. For us Christians, we're not looking for a silhouette to be filled. All of the silhouettes are incidental. Yeah, they're all, for us, for many evangelical Christians, we're not looking at Old Testament for a plot conflict. We're usually thinking about, I committed a sin that disqualifies me from heaven and qualifies me for hell, and Jesus died so he can overturn that decision, right? That actually has no silhouette. You see how we need to do some work to try and root it in the Old Testament, right? So this, just understanding the difference of plot conflict and the function of this character changes the way that we're going to read the story from here on out. That takes us 2 steps forward into understanding how to read the Bible. Do you guys see that? Right? I'm just curious what questions or thoughts are raised from this particular, I guess, proposition I have. Immediately, is there something that like, what does this mean for me? Are there any questions so far?
I think an observation for me, I think Jesus understood that he was the Passover lamb. I think that's right. I mean, he understood that like because in the Last Supper, right? This is my body broken for you, and they're celebrating the Passover. So he understood that, but the disciples didn't understand. It was only a reflection.
Any other thoughts? Any other challenges that are being raised up in your head right now? That's okay if there are challenges, because this is challenging material. I know JV last week we were talking about why we should even read Old Testament, right? And part of this is that if we truly claim to love Jesus and Jesus' stories about himself, even the way that Jesus understood what he was trying to be was so informed by the 3 quarters before, right? So as Christians, reading the Hebrew Bible is sort of non-negotiable, because the most important things that Jesus thought about himself are complete references to this, right? So like, even if we don't think that the solution is here somewhere or that the problem is here somewhere, at least Jesus' self-understanding is here, right? And that's important to us.
So follow what you said about the whole sin proposition you're talking.
Yeah.
That I guess that also implies that a certain understanding of going to listen to such a understanding that be able to go ahead and use Christ to use us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like you said, that I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, it's what I've been taught.
Yeah.
So with that in play also, that even that can pertain to say that that's a resolution that I
Sure.
come across because it's how I
Yes. And so here's what I would say, is that, so even with our evangelical Christian sort of upbringing, most of us are coming from evangelical backgrounds. Maybe some of us have a more Filipino Catholic background, right? And those are very different. Like if you ask English Catholics, they have a very different relationship with Catholicism than Filipinos do, right? One of the major forces one of the major kind of frames for Philippine Catholicism that we have to recognize is the colonial empire, right? Spanish Catholics were the colonizing force for the Philippines. It makes sense why a lot of Filipinos have generational trauma related to Catholicism. Whereas in England, that's more a traditional, long-standing, right, very, very old, rooted religion that didn't include violent colonial occupation unless you're Irish, right? Because then that's what happened with them. So that's something to recognize. So there's a lot of complications here. What I will say is that regardless of your upbringing, if we're working with the same text, you can think of it like a furniture in a room, right? That's unpacked. So when you move to a new house, you have all these boxes of furniture. This is a lamp, you have a couch, you have a bed. I don't know what the bed looks like that, but you have all these furnitures, right? You have all this furniture, and you move it into the living room. That's furniture that's yours and it's useful, and you had it in your last home. But when you move it into the new framework, until you unpack it and properly position it, it's a bother, right? And you won't fully be able to rest in it. So even when we're talking about sin and no one comes into the Father but by me, we're not denying that those are still true, but how they fit into the new framework is the challenge, right? So it's like allowing them to really become a part of the living room. That's the challenge. So for us, we're dealing with the same material, the same furniture, but we're arranging them differently. And in the end, you still have a house that you can live in, but one's a lot more comfortable, I think. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, so this is what I mean when I say that we should sort of let you probably heard me say this before, when I say that we should let the stories speak for themselves. You've maybe heard me say that. We should let the text speak for itself, right? Does anybody know what I mean by that? Or sometimes I say, let the story tell you what it thinks. Yeah, and so there's a challenge here. It's a good reminder before I read a text to remind myself, okay, I should let the story speak for itself.
I think
Yes.
I think my observation even in our Bible study, right? Even when the question is indirect, in verse, like for example, verse 2, can you tell me what is said about Jesus? The answer is correct, but they are interpreting it.
Yeah. And
But actually, it doesn't say that. It just says,
yes, and so really it's because we've got into the practice. It's a habit at this point. It's a reflex. It's a reflex that when we get into a scriptural text, one of the very first things we're taught to do in Sunday school is moralize it, right? That's what we do. That's how we teach kids how to read scripture. We don't teach them how to be challenged with the text. We teach them how to find the what should I do to not get spanked and what should I do to get, Exactly. And so while those things are very good and true and helpful, but you can see how when it goes undeveloped or when we don't exercise another muscle, we end up having a lopsided thing. It's like having one. So full disclosure, this shirt right here, I got this in high school. I think that this is from H&M, and this shirt has always had a smaller right. It's malformed. So the length of this is smaller. So this always feels tight, but this one feels loose. And so I used to think that, man, I need to work out the other arm because this one is stronger than this one, but it's not the case. It's just that this is lopsided. And so what we really do need to exercise another muscle, which is to say that we read slowly, we read not for theologizing, we read not for moralizing, we read for knowledge and understanding, right? So one of the challenges in a lot of Christian circles is sometimes knowledge and understanding feels too complicated, right? And some people really want to move to simplify, right? That's perfectly fine if the thing is not complicated, right? But as we've studied over the last semester and the last few weeks, is that the text is pretty complicated. There's a lot of layers to it. There's a lot of weaving in parts, weaving out parts. There's some things that don't get mentioned until 7 books later, right? And that's the challenge. So when I kind of say that these stories have their own integrity, right? Their own integrity meaning their own structure and their own logic, right? The text that's a unit is going to have a logic within itself, right? You should read Proverbs on its own terms, meaning that Proverbs is structured as there's the introduction that's 10 chapters, and then the whole body of Proverbs, which is different collections of Proverbs added at different times, right? That's the logic of the text. And then whoever edited it bound it up. Reflection on wisdom at the beginning, reflection of wisdom at the end, and everything in the middle. It makes sense on its own terms, right? That's how it is. When you're reading a parable in the New Testament, there's a logic. One of the rules of reading a parable is Jesus is speaking in code, but he's also speaking very plainly. Both are true. He's speaking in language that everybody understands, but he's weaving the words that everybody gets into stories that are very complicated, and they require you to know the Old Testament, right? That's the basis of the thing, right? When Jesus is doing a rebuke, oftentimes he's play acting. What is he play acting? What does a play act mean? What does it mean to play act, huh? Yeah, it's pretending, but it's not just pretending. He's particularly play acting a role, right? He's personifying something. Yeah. What? Yeah, he's doing a reenactment. So for example, one reenactment that Jesus does is that when he goes into the temple and he goes into the center of the temple, he turns over the things and he says the things he says. He's actually putting on the persona of 3 different prophets. Jeremiah did the same thing. He said the same thing, right? Hosea did something like that. So he's putting on 3 different prophets at that moment, right? He's saying the thing that Jeremiah said, right? A house of prayer. So this is when Jesus does that, it's both politically active, right? Because why would I say that's a politically charged statement? Because prior, Jesus had just been received as the king of the Jews. They thought, David's here, he's back, he's riding on David. It's Passover. Passover is the festival of what? Liberation of the Jewish people from oppressive empire. And they're going to the seat of the Roman presence in the Jewish communities, right? It's the day of Passover where all of the Jews from all over the diaspora of the Roman Empire come into Jerusalem. So a packed city is extremely packed on Passover, right? This is why historians have called it a powder keg, because it was literally all of the militant forces of rebel Jerusalem comes into Jerusalem on a, yeah.
Is ready.
Which is why if in the temple during the Herodian period, they put a military barracks and attached it to the temple, because there had been uprisings in the temple before, because of how quick it is it flares up into a conflict, right? And so, very important. What Jesus did there was a political statement, because him riding into Jerusalem makes who nervous? The Romans, because they're beefing up the guard. They're waiting for everybody to come in, and they say, "Oh man, I think this is the pretender king that we've been hearing about traveling all across Galilee. He's here in Jerusalem on the week of their festival. He rides on a donkey, but yeah." And so it's a very puzzling thing for the Romans to understand, but they understand that regardless of who he is, this is dangerous, right? He's somebody that you need to watch, right? And so at that point, the Romans are nervous. Jesus comes into the city receiving the king's welcome, but one of the Gospels tells us that he's weeping as it happens, right? Because he knows what is to come, right? Or he knows that they don't understand, however you want to interpret that. But he comes into the temple, and then the first thing he does is anger the temple. He disrupts the entire Jewish economic system. He turns over, he calls all of the people, the temple guard, liars, thieves, murderers. You're keeping the Gentiles out. This is a house of prayer, right? And he condemns them the same way Jeremiah, Isaiah, and all the prophets had condemned them, right? It's a political statement both ways, right? The ride into Jerusalem scared the Romans. The ride into the temple is the thing that put the target on his back with the temple officials, right? And so what we're trying to do here is let the stories have their own integrity, meaning that the stories have a logic in and of itself, and if we interpret theologically first before we allow the story to really play itself out, then we miss it. Because we often will think of Jesus' attack on the turn in the temple as a moment of fulfillment, right? We know that because we're Christians who have the benefit of hindsight for both of the editions of the Bible, right? But if you were a member of that, if you were in the crowd at that day, what would that have represented? A complete challenge, right? What Jesus did was a challenge because you were at the temple for something, right? If you were at the temple as a Gentile or a Jew, you had come likely to make amends, to reconcile, or to do some sort of ceremony or sacrifice. Jesus comes and upends the temple, and you are unable to do it. Would you have been happy with what Jesus did? Yeah, or you might have felt that, right? You might have felt I had just traveled all the way up from Capernaum with my goat, just because I can't afford the goat at the temple, so I brought my goat. And then now I'm here, and now the temple's disrupted. What now? So you see, there's a logic there.
Or probably I will say, I've been coming here for the last 10 years.
And this is the first time this happened. See,
All of a sudden, the religious leaders are overcharging me.
exactly. Sure. So this is where, when you're looking at the logic, the integrity of the story, it should cause you to ask some questions about what's really going on in the story, right? Because sometimes we read the story and then we just get to a theological point, but we're rushing, right? That's a rush. So this is what I mean when we should let the stories speak for themselves, is so that we can protect ourselves from artificially reading Jesus into the story. Right? What we're saying is that we should let the plots of the stories develop the questions that we should ask themselves, right? If you remember the text, the Hebrew Bible, it's wisdom literature, meaning by design, it's complicated, it's vague in certain parts, it's over-detailed in certain parts, it's paralleled, it's repetition, and all of that is designed to what? Get you to ask better questions so that you can turn the stories over, right? And mull them over. And what we need to do is not just try to find every opportunity to cram Jesus into a Hebrew Bible slot, which is what we do. You go to the Daniel story, and there's a fourth person in the furnace. Who is that? Jesus. Did they think that? Right? We think that maybe as modern people who have the stories of Jesus, but if you didn't have the apostolic writings, you're still wondering who that was, right? In the thing, what does the text let you say? Somebody in there, like a son of man, is in there, or someone like a son of God is in there, right? In there, he's not being burned, and so these are. If you're reading the Hebrew Bible on its own terms, that's still a question that's outstanding, right? And so we often try to cram Jesus into symbolism, into the verses or whatever, right? But I want to let the Hebrew Bible develop the story of the problem and how it will be resolved, right? And that happens on the large scale and on the small scale, but it happens on its own terms. But I think what you find is the way that it identifies the problem, right? The way that reading the story along the plot, with reference to the plot, the way that it identifies the problem and the way that it identifies the person who will then bring the resolution. The Hebrew Bible is a glove that is waiting to be filled by somebody's hand. And that's how everybody reads the Hebrew Bible before the time of Jesus. Right? Before Jesus, everybody's wondering how this whole thing that's complicated and huge, how it all gets resolved. Right? There's this there's this phrase that N.T. Wright, Nicholas Thomas Wright, he's a very, very well-known and well-respected New Testament scholar. The way he says it is that Jesus is how the world is put to rights. And so Jesus is how the world is put to rights. And what he means by that is just all the things that are wrong with the world, Jesus is how it gets put right. But how it gets put right is how we read the story, right? So there's in the Lord of the Rings, the Battle of Osgiliath, right, when the last bastion of hope before Minas Tirith falls, right, in Gondor. There's a Sam and Frodo. They're sitting on a wall and they think they're going to die, and Sam has a whole speech to Frodo because Frodo's losing heart, and then Sam will say, "Can all the wrong things become untrue?" Right? And so really there's a story here that Jesus is that reason, that all the things that had gone wacky in the beginning of the story, they find their yes, or they find their end in the story of Jesus. But everybody before Jesus, that's a big question mark. Who that person is a big question mark, right? And so what it requires for somebody who doesn't know who Jesus is to read the Hebrew Bible and use their imagination to see all of the myriad ways this could get put back in its box, right? And that's the challenge. And so the claim of the apostles and of Jesus is that he is the hand that fills the glove of the Hebrew Bible. But everybody in the Hebrew Bible is wondering who it would be, right? So if you read it forwards, you have to try and practice, I don't know Jesus yet, right? You have to practice all of the questioning and all of the longing and all of the anticipation, so that when you do get to the New Testament, you say, finally, yes, oh, I see it now, I can see it. And things start to click in the ways that they had never clicked before because you had asked all of the questions that needed asking. Do you see that? All the questions that need asking are in the Hebrew Bible, right? Jesus is the answer, yes. And he tells you all the cool ways that he is the answer, but without an understanding of the Hebrew Bible in its fullness or in a rich way, you don't get to click all the pieces, right? It's like trying to build a Lego set without the first half of the blueprints, right? And so I've come shorthand to just say that, you get the name of the anointed representative that the Jewish people were waiting for, right? When Jesus appears on the scene, right, you get the name. But the profile that you need to attach to the name is already a category that's formed by the Hebrew Bible, right? So, like, Jesus is the name, right? But what Jesus means, all that's Hebrew Bible. Do you see that? You see how the logic of that is? Jesus is the name, Yahweh saves, right? But all that Jesus is saving from and to and all those things, that's all filled in by the Hebrew Bible. It's all filled in by the prophets and the longing of the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim and the wisdom of the Ketuvim, right? Because you have to remember, people were scandalized by the fact that Jesus claimed to be that representative. That was the major scandal, right? And then he then goes to confront the leaders of Jerusalem, who were well acquainted with all of this content in the Hebrew Bible, right? They knew this part well. They knew the silhouette, but they didn't buy into the name, right? And so he goes to confront Jerusalem, the leaders of Jerusalem, and he allows himself, right? He allows himself, in fact, he purposefully kicks the hornet's nest and gets himself killed, right? That's the logic of the Jesus story, is that Jesus knew exactly who would get angry at this claim. It was both Rome and Jerusalem. Neither of them were happy, and he stirs the pot, right? He antagonizes the leaders, right? He cleverly and sarcastically insults Caesar, right? Whose face is on that coin? You can give it to him then. It's his. Right? Like, these are all really huge political statements on Jesus' part. He stirred both pots, right? And he gets himself killed. And how he did that was apparently a shocker to everybody standing around, because they all thought they had Jesus, right? They all thought they got him, right? But Jesus was being a very slippery fish. They couldn't quite grasp him. And nobody knew how to make sense of why Jesus was doing the things he was doing. That's why Peter is like, no, you don't get killed. How could you say that? We followed you for 3 years. What was this all for if you die now? Right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They couldn't understand. You worked all this time to get people to be quiet, and you're going to go straight? right? And so there's a lot of things. And then they said, well, if you're going to go, we should get swords. And Jesus says, no, that one sword in that bag, that's enough. Just, right? Whatever, right? And so it was really challenging. Jesus was being a very, Jesus, every step along the way, as a character, he's a twist of the plot, right? You're supposed to, in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, how does it begin? It's a quotation from Amos, Joel, and Isaiah, right? Make way, right? And it comes from the story of making highways because Yahweh will return, right? Make straight paths because Yahweh will return, right? And so it says all that stuff. A voice calls out in the wilderness. Yahweh will come and return and deliver his people. And then you get, and if you can look at it like a movie, there's like a little prophecy that says, and God will one day return to come and deliver his people. And then the next slide is some guy, right? That's not God, that's Jesus. That's that guy from Nazareth, right? Jesus as a character is a plot twist. He's exactly not what people were waiting for, right? They were waiting for Yahweh, right? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what they get is a guy whose name is Yahweh Saves, right? That's the challenge. That somehow this is the answer. Somehow this is Yahweh. That's why when Jesus claims to be the representative, they're like, the scriptures will tell us that this is supposed to be God. Is that your claim? And then that's why he says, well, you say it, not me, right? So Jesus is a twist of the plot. However, once you get to the empty tomb and the risen Jesus is hanging out with all of the disciples and the people are now reading the Hebrew Bible thinking, I think I know what that was about, right? Things start to click for them. Do you remember the story of Emmaus? The story of the road to Emmaus? So right after the week after Jesus was crucified, people had come for Passover. And not only had people come for Passover, there was a public execution the week of Passover. Right? If you remember the way that Jesus was decided to be killed, it was the temple guards deciding to kill him in the middle of the night. They called a kangaroo court in the middle of the temple, and they said, I know we can't get Jesus legally. We're going to have to lie and incriminate him to the Roman court because we can't kill him, right? So they knowingly conspired to do an injustice to this man they knew they had no rights to kill, but they had to kill him in order to protect the Jewish power struggle because they didn't want the Jewish people to get crushed by rebellion, right? Because if it pops off and the Jesus people start to riot in the streets, Rome will have to cleanse Jerusalem, right? So it's a very dangerous place for them. So they conspire to kill Jesus. They do a kangaroo court. Jesus is killed, expedited, right? Within the week. Jesus is there on Sunday. By next Sunday, by Friday, he's dead, right? Really quick turnaround. And then right after that time, Jesus is risen. People who were there for Passover and then watched the public execution, they watched the spectacle of it, they're going home, right? Some of them were really excited to see what Jesus would have been doing, what this whole thing was all about. I think they might have brought their swords into the city because they thought, well, Jesus is coming. It's Passover. This is the time. This is when it's going to happen. We need to be ready. And then he delivers himself over to be killed. He screws it up the moment he gets into Jerusalem by angering the temple officials. I thought he was on our side. What's going on? They're still going to kill him. And then what? He's dead. Now they're going home thinking, man, what just happened? What was this whole thing we followed for 3 years? Right? I brought my family to him. I heard the story that my cousin over there his daughter was healed, right? And all these stories were building up, and the climax is dead. They're left empty-handed. The disciples are scattered, right? They're cowering in upper rooms. They're scared in the dark. They don't want to be caught. They don't want to be killed, right? And you have people walking home, and they're trying to piece together what just happened, right? And so right after that, some people are putting together, this is, I think, what the Jesus thing was about. Not everybody was like that. Some people saw it beforehand, some people didn't, some people only heard about what happened in Jerusalem. Right? And so the whole Old Testament for us, the whole Hebrew Bible, is sort of like how we get to understand who Jesus is. Right? The building of the silhouette of Jesus is the Hebrew Bible. Right? You only get Jesus in the New Testament. But all of the understanding of Jesus comes from the Hebrew Bible. Right? And then what it means for us in the future is developed by the apostles. Right? With the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It's a helpful paradigm. It's almost like the Hebrew Bible gets us to Jesus as Lord, and then the New Testament presents us Jesus as Lord. Right? How we get to Jesus as Lord is Hebrew Bible, but Jesus as Lord is the New Testament. Right? And so when you view it as a whole in light of the revelation of Jesus, and then us as readers of the Bible, then we have some habits to develop, right? We have some practices to put into our toolbox. Because my history nerd self wants to qualify this and just say that the whole Hebrew Bible is how we need the Messiah as the Lord, right? The Messiah is the answer. And it turns out that the Messiah has a name. We receive it in the New Testament, right? We finally get who that is in the New Testament. We understand all that he needs to be through the Hebrew Bible. Right? And you could just say that that's splitting hairs and that's semantics, but it's the logic of the entire text, right? That's how the Hebrew Bible works. The New Testament is things start to pay out, right? That's a helpful paradigm for me. But because Jesus and the apostles appeal to their scriptures as a way of showing the true identity of Jesus. That's why they're always referencing, even Jesus. Jesus references Jonah, right? Jesus is referencing all the time the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. And so they see so much because they're so aware of the Hebrew Bible. They're aware of what to anticipate, where to be challenged, where their understanding was almost but not quite fully, right? As if the spotlight is, sometimes we read it as if the spotlight shines on Jesus backwards onto the Hebrew Bible. But it's actually the other way around. The Hebrew Bible is the one that's shining the spotlight onto Jesus, right? That's the source of all of the anticipation, right? And the way that Jesus and the apostles talk about the Hebrew Bible, they see as much light being cast forward by it onto Jesus by the Hebrew Bible, right? And I think this becomes mutual. Jesus then will elucidate and illuminate parts of the Old Testament that we didn't quite fully get, right? That's why Hebrews has a whole section where it's almost like a midrash. It's like a rabbi teaching Old Testament about don't you know that Abraham, he had faith. He had faith that God is true to his promises. And so even if he killed his son, because God is true to his promise, then he would raise his son from the dead. That's just how it is, because God is true to his promise. If God asked me to kill my son, then it only logically follows that my son will be raised, because it's through him that the promise will be given, right? And so it becomes a mutual. You get to know the real Jesus by reading the Hebrew Bible, and you get to further understand the Hebrew Bible by getting to know Jesus. It becomes a loop, right? So it's symbiotic that way. And that's just been the journey of the Jesus movement with the Hebrew Bible ever since. It's been like a constant reading of the Hebrew Bible, understanding Jesus better, understanding the Hebrew Bible better, and so on and so forth. If we're looking at that story chart that you got in this class, then Jesus becomes the climax, right? But the question is it the cross or the resurrection or the birth? Where in Jesus' events is that climax? Right? So it's obvious that the climax of the story are the Jesus events, right? And all things are being worked out after that, right? But the big incident for our story is the Jesus event, right? He's the thing that's the plot twist and changes the game, right? And then how all things resolve from the Jesus event, that changes. But What would it be? Where would the climax be in the Jesus events? Right? We would say, so I remember last time some people said second coming. The second coming is a result. It's a result of the climax. It's a result of the Jesus event, right? Right? The climax could be where he died. This is where we're now going to practice a little bit of plot development. That's the end.
The first advent, because the second coming, the second advent. So where's the first advent? It's the
What was that? Yeah, it could be empty tomb, right? But somebody could argue that the empty tomb is a result of the crucifixion, right? So this is where it becomes a very interesting statement, right? Where is the climax? Because that will sort of dictate what's included in the plot resolution. Yeah, they might be two sides of one coin, right? So you can even think of this as reflected in our own Christian traditions. So depending on where we've come from and what our history is, a lot of Baptists or a lot of evangelicals generally, as coming from like the Lutheran tradition and coming from the Protestant Reformation and the Reformers, we emphasize the cross a lot, right? But if you go east, and you go even more east than Rome, and you go into the Eastern Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, their major event is the resurrection, right? For some traditions, it's both, right? But each emphasis, it provides a slightly different take on the story, right? Whether it's the cross or the resurrection. So my impression would be like, if I were going to try and fit the resurrection fit the resurrection as the climax right after the cross, you would kind of see it as like we're waiting for if the resurrection is the climax, then we're waiting for what's the conflict that's solved, right? What's after the resurrection, right? So what do you guys think? So you said the cross, right? The cross. Does anybody have any other thoughts as to the climax? Yeah, you could see it as the birth of Jesus, right? The second coming doesn't make sense?
Just by, going by what the climax describes as, it's downhill after the climax.
Yeah, sure. And so one of the challenges with second coming being the climax is that what does it render the two events of the cross and the resurrection? Do you know what I mean? That means they're just stepping stones, right? But it seems as though that the narrative demands the cross and resurrection at least to be the center, right? Whether or not you emphasize one over the other, the cross is the thing that makes things able to be resolved, right? And how it gets resolved is a longer question, right? And second coming has not even happened yet, right? And so, so the second coming is sort of the landing of the plane, right? Everything that's kicked up into the air by the event of the climax falls and settles at the second coming, right? And so you have the challenge here. And so it's like, so imagine reading the news these days, right? There's a lot of things that are in the middle of happening, right? You can look at the Ukraine conflict to keep it. We won't get too morbid here, but if you look at the Ukraine conflict, it's very much in the throes of happening, right? Right? It's even actually hard to see where the climax could be, right? And actually, a lot of us are waking up in the morning anticipating a climactic moment, right? Like this is it. That was the moment, and we just have to see where the dust settles then, right? And so, I think the cross and the resurrection at the very least are the climax moment, right? This is where, and I think it's even presented that way in the Gospels, when he's hanging on the cross and the sky darkens and it's the day of the Lord, right? It's the atonement. It's the judgment. This is the thing that's anticipated in Leviticus, right? This is the moment where the powers are judged. That's what Paul is saying, like, what happened on the cross? That was where the enmity was put to death, right?
So wasn't it the goal that Jesus was to die?
Yes, exactly.
Wouldn't that have been reached?
Yes, and so I think there's a case to be made that the beginning of the story arc of the climax moment is the cross, right? You could even argue that it's Palm Sunday, right? Palm Sunday, and all of the events leading up is the beginning. So like, there's a scholar of Mark that calls the Gospel of Mark in two parts. That once he gets to Jerusalem, the crucifixion has begun. The shadow of the cross looms over all of the events leading up to the crucifixion, right? And so right when you get to Jerusalem and Jesus is weeping, he's already begun to do battle. He's already at the moment where things are happening, right? N.T. Wright says that from the moment he steps into Jerusalem, the powers of sin and death are converging on Jesus, and they're beginning to oppress. And so the moment that it's finished is the resurrection, right? From the point of resurrection, the dust settles. He even says it, right? And so from the point of resurrection, the world is different. So there's a book that N.T. Wright wrote. It's called The Day the Revolution Began. And so the hinge upon which the world turns is the cross event. It begins at the cross, but the hinge is at the resurrection, right? That's when the world turns, right? It has its turn at the resurrection. And so is the cross resurrection, is the cross and resurrection the climax? Or is it cross resurrection? Or is it cross? Or is it resurrection? I think that those are very interesting conversations to have, but the cross and resurrection, at least, are the central point, right? And so this is actually where the plot chart begins to fail us, right? Because every model is imperfect, right? And it's in light of what we're going to talk about in sessions to come, right? Because the climax happens, some of the dust settles, right? But then you have the epistles, right? Right? And then you have the epilogue at Revelation, right? And those don't neatly fit into the plot structure, at least without some qualifications or about understanding about how things settle at the end of the resurrection, right? Because the apostles will then appeal to the kingdom, they'll appeal to the announcement of the kingdom, they'll appeal to the cross and the resurrection, they'll appeal to the exaltation of Jesus. For them, it's a bundled event, right? The Jesus events are all one moment for them, and it's all signifying a turning of the seasons, right? And then they'll isolate certain ones depending on which plot thread they want to isolate, right? But then they might isolate a different one, depending, right? A good challenge is read the epistles and Acts, and read all of the sermons of Jesus about the gospel proclamation, and see how many times they even mention the cross or the resurrection, right? There's the sermon of Peter in Acts, when he gets up there and he talks about, he quotes Psalm 2. He actually doesn't mention the cross or the resurrection, right? There's a gospel proclamation that doesn't require it, right? So because they're tracing different plot threads, right? And that's okay with them, right? And so when Paul summarizes the gospel in Romans 1, he doesn't mention the cross, right? He mentions the exaltation of the royal Messiah as the Son of God. But in 1 Corinthians, when he explains what the word gospel means, he mentions the cross and the resurrection together, right? And then later on in the chapter, he talks about his exaltation to the cosmic rule as the gospel, without any reference to the cross or the resurrection, right? And so they have a lot more going on in mind, right? And I think it comes from their understanding of the Hebrew Bible, right? They understand what plot threads can be resolved, right? And what we can take. Usually we go cross-resurrection, and that's the only thread we pick at. But it's a bundle for them. So it's like a fiber optic cable. You can think of it like that, right? So there's one cable, but then fiber optic cables are bundles of cables. And when you bind them, it looks like one cable, but when you cut it, there's lots of little threads running side by side, right? And they come from the same source. So the resolution, the point is that all of the stories of the Hebrew Bible are like a bundle of stories, a bundle of threads that resolve in such a way that it brings the future resolution of everything in the New Testament, right? Into the present world where there's still escalating conflict, right? So even we get like a prologue that's still future for us, right? That's what Revelation is. It's a proclamation of final victory that we are still awaiting, right? We're still in the sort of dust settling after the cross, right? It's as if the future resolution gets pulled back into here, and we have to kind of wrestle with that. The overlapping of heaven and earth, if you were in the Ephesians class, right? With the age to come and the current age. And so think about when the Apostle Paul writes to the Colossians, and he says, you know what occurs? It occurs to me from time to time what my life is about. I am filling up what is yet remaining of the Messiah's suffering. The Apostle Paul says that in Colossians. It's a very challenging phrase. I am filling up what is yet remaining of the Messiah's suffering, right? And that almost seems to claim as though the crucifixion of the Messiah had not ended, right? That's a challenge, actually. It's actually a really difficult passage because some people have called heresy on this very passage. They said, like, no, Jesus' death is final. Paul didn't mean what he meant, right? And so that's actually a really difficult challenge, right? What Paul meant by him fulfilling what is yet remaining in the Messiah's suffering. And I think it's totally bound up in Paul's theology of the church, of what the body of Christ is, right? And it's all headed up in the Messiah, right? And so if you've ever read Hebrews and you read Colossians, you might be thinking, wait, I thought the book of Hebrews said he suffered once and for all. And that's exactly right, I think. But in the life of the Messiah's body, the church, that's ongoing, right? It's as if the Messiah's people are themselves replaying their own stories, millions of different life stories in this plot conflict resolution, right? Everything is being brought into reconciliation in their own different way, which means that we all have a cross to bear, which Paul says as much, right? And I think I heard Jesus say something about that once, right? About bearing up a cross. So we're meant to see our lives as little iterations of the whole thing, like a microcosm, in which case we're both post-climax and in the conflict simultaneously, the convening of the two ages, right? And our lives become little subplots that point to the main plot. That's actually the logic of it, right? So if you remember, there was a time in the 80s and 90s, there was a whole Acts 29 movement, because Acts is 28 chapters, and so the call to action is that you are Acts 29, that the life of the church still continues on in you. And that's a little corny, but I think it's true, right? I think that there's the nut of truth in it is that we are actually in the middle of the history of the people of God, right? We're awaiting the second coming, which is where the dust finally settles, right? And so we were speaking to that thing once before, but I think this is why the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, as old as they are, it doesn't stop speaking, because the story of the people of God is still alive and well. And this book is not yet fully completed in that sense, right? The storyline has not been fully colored in, right? I've heard some scholars say that we are reading the Old Testament with too much Christological bent, too much Christ in it. And that sounded heretical to me the first time I heard it, right? What do you mean we can't read the Old Testament with Christ in it? How is it even possible to read too much Christ into the Hebrew Bible when it points to Jesus, right? But I realize what some of them are cautioning is this thing where you're reading things into the text that were not there yet. For them, that was puzzlement, right? For them, it was wonder, it was hope, it was tension, it was anguish, it was waiting, right? The New Testament is where you're supposed to go, that was Jesus. But when we're reading the Hebrew Bible, we can't give ourselves that yet, right? It's like eating the chocolate bar in the middle of your run, right? You got to eat it at the end, right? And so I think this is where I want to land the plane for us for the evening, is that we have just kind of explored the Christological readings of the Hebrew Bible and what it means to really allow the subplots and the character development to speak for themselves, and to not import Jesus too much into the Old Testament, as well as not be shy to bring the New Old Testament into the New, because it's meant to be read that way, right? And then to do the thing that many Bible study teachers have told us not to do, which is to emotionalize the text. Absolutely emotionalize the text. It's the only way this thing is useful to us. But what we have to remember is that our emotions are not the final say on the text, right? Right? We have to bring ourselves into the text and let the text examine it, examine us, to challenge us, to weep with the stories of the text, to weep over our current conditions with the text, but to be encouraged that the community of believers is constantly finding reconciliation within their understanding of the text, right? And so to allow Jesus to really elucidate and illuminate the way that the story is being played out in our lives. Do we have any questions? Because I know we talked about some major things today. Any things before we can close?
So in other words, it's better to excel instead back, and not just be in the rush to put your shoes.
Yeah, I think that for us especially, who have been cautioned in many of our church settings to not put ourselves in the text, I think it was a well-meaning caution, but it's impossible to do. No matter what you do, you will be the person reading the text. And if you had a bad day reading the text, your bad day will be with you as you read, right? So that's impossible to not do. The real goal is to just be aware of what you're bringing, right? If I'm bringing my bad day into the text, that's worth noting, right? It's worth noting why a story about the genealogies would be a waste of time for me on a day where I had a bad day. Like, what does it have to do with me, right? That's absolutely a thing that you should notice. Rather than deny it a place, it's better to recognize that it's there and take note of it, right? That's more helpful. It's a better practice in the end, because then you don't lie to yourself and think that you're always objectively reading the text. Because I think that's the byproduct, is when you tell people not to bring emotions into the text, they'll try to do that, and whatever they understand, they'll think it had nothing to do with them, right? No, you still interpreted it, you still made a decision, and you could still be wrong, right? At least when you bring yourself into the text, you know that I was not objective when I came here. I was not objective when I left, right? My hope for any sense of truth is to read with community, to read and to challenge myself with community. I think that's a goal for reading. I think that's why Paul tells Timothy to not neglect the public reading of Scripture. Not even the teaching, just the reading of it. Public reading keeps people accountable, I think. Any other questions before we leave? All right, I'm going to close us in prayer, and if you have any questions, we can talk about it right now, but I'll close us. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day once again, for the opportunity to really dive into the text and to understand a little bit more about plot and character and conflict and how Jesus, in reading Jesus, fits in. I know there's a difficulty in studying Old Testament at length in not importing the New Testament in. That's such a challenging way to read the Old Testament. It's like trying to forget somebody's birthday. It's almost impossible once you know it, or trying to forget somebody's name once you know it. It's difficult to undo. So, Lord, be with us as we practice the habit of reading the Old Testament on its own terms, that we might understand you better. In your name we pray, amen.